Welcome to Unknown Suspect, where every shadow hides a secret and every story leads to a truth you didn't see coming. Ashcombe House and the Quiet Death. Chapter 1. An Invitation of Unease. Hercule Poirot valued order above all things, order in thought, order in conduct, and, whenever possible, order in his surroundings. It was therefore with mild displeasure that he regarded the envelope lying upon his breakfast tray, placed there without his prior knowledge or consent by an over-efficient hotel porter. The envelope itself was of excellent quality, thick, cream-coloured, and embossed with a discreet crest. Poirot adjusted his moustache thoughtfully before opening it. He had learned long ago that appearances, though important, often concealed discomforting truths. The letter inside was brief and courteous. Sir Lionel Ashcombe requests the pleasure of Monsieur Hercule Poirot's company for a weekend at Ashcombe House, Sussex. Sir Lionel greatly admires Monsieur Poirot's intellect and would welcome the honour of his presence. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Admiration, he knew, was rarely the true reason behind such invitations, particularly when it came from men of wealth and influence who had lived comfortably enough without the need of detectives, until they did not. Poirot folded the letter neatly. Something about the wording troubled him. It was too careful, too deliberate. There was an urgency hidden beneath the politeness, like a clock ticking behind a velvet curtain. 2 days later, Poirot arrived at Ashcombe House. The estate stood upon a gentle rise, its pale stone facade dignified rather than grand. Tall windows reflected the grey Sussex sky, and clipped hedges bordered a long gravel drive. Everything appeared correct. Too correct, Poirot thought. Houses, like people, revealed themselves through small imperfections. Here, imperfections had been carefully erased. Sir Lionel Ashcombe greeted Poirot in the entrance hall. He was a man in his early 60s, neatly dressed, with iron grey hair and a manner that suggested lifelong authority. His smile was welcoming, yet his eyes flickered with something less composed. "Monsieur Poirot, it is a great pleasure," Sir Lionel said, extending his hand. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" "Most comfortable, monsieur," Poirot replied, "and I thank you for your invitation." Sir Lionel hesitated, only for a moment, but Poirot noticed. Hesitation was rarely accidental. Tea was served in the drawing-room where the remaining guests had assembled. Poirot took in the room with interest, tasteful furnishings, muted colours, and portraits of Ashcombe ancestors watching from the walls with stern disapproval. Sir Lionel made the introductions. His niece, Miss Margaret Ashcombe, was a composed young woman in her late 20s, with clear eyes and a manner of quiet restraint. She spoke politely, but revealed little. Next was Miss Clara Bell, Sir Lionel's private secretary. She was efficient in appearance and nervous in movement, her fingers constantly adjusting her spectacles. Mr. Arthur Wynne, a business associate, possessed an easy smile and a voice that carried confidence perhaps too readily. He laughed often, though the sound lacked warmth. Finally, Dr. Edwin Hale, the family physician, inclined his head courteously. He was calm, professional, and impeccably dressed. His expression gave nothing away. Poirot seated himself carefully, noting where each guest chose to sit. The arrangement was not accidental. People placed themselves according to comfort, habit, or avoidance, and all three were revealing. Conversation flowed easily enough at first. There was polite discussion of the weather, of London, of the recent restoration of the house. Yet beneath it all lay an unmistakable tension. Words were measured, laughter came too quickly or not at all. Sir Lionel spoke of changes he intended to make, changes to the house, to his affairs, to the future. Each mention caused a subtle reaction. Margaret's hand tightened on her teacup. Clara looked down. Wynne leaned forward with sudden interest. Dr. Hale watched silently. Poirot observed his expression attentive but neutral. His little grey cells were already at work. As evening approached, rain began to fall, tapping steadily against the tall windows. The house seemed to draw inward, as though closing itself off from the outside world. Dinner was formal and subdued. Sir Lionel excused himself early, claiming fatigue. He paused at the doorway and glanced back, his gaze lingering briefly on each guest. "I believe," he said slowly, "that matters long delayed are best resolved without further postponement." No one replied. Later, as Poirot prepared for bed, he reflected upon the day. There had been no crime, no accusation, no request for help, and yet everything pointed towards one inevitable conclusion. Ashcombe House was not hosting a social weekend. It was gathering witnesses. Poirot folded his clothes with care and adjusted his moustache in the mirror. "Eh bien," he murmured softly, "let us see what truth has invited me here." Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, as though counting down the hours to something that could no longer be avoided. Chapter 2. The Sudden Death. Morning arrived at Ashcombe House with an unnatural quiet. The rain had ceased during the night, leaving behind a grey mist that clung to the windows and softened the outlines of the gardens beyond. Hercule Poirot, immaculately dressed and perfectly punctual, descended the staircase expecting the faint hum of domestic activity. Instead, he found silence. Breakfast had been laid in the dining room, yet no one had begun. The silver teapot remained untouched. Toast cooled beneath its cover. The air carried a faint sense of abandonment, as though time itself had paused. Poirot glanced at the clock. Sir Lionel Ashcombe was a man of habits, according to his secretary, and punctuality was one of them. He was never late for breakfast. Miss Clara Bell entered the room hurriedly, her face pale and her movements uncertain. Has Sir Lionel come down yet?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No, mademoiselle," Poirot replied gently, "and that, I think, is most unusual." Moments later, Dr. Hale appeared, followed by Mr. Wynne and Miss Margaret Ashcombe. A brief exchange of concerned glances passed among them. Sir Lionel's valet was summoned and instructed to check the master's study. When the man did not return promptly, a sense of unease settled heavily upon the group. Poirot remained seated, his expression thoughtful. He did not rise until he heard the sound, a sharp cry, abruptly cut short. They found Sir Lionel Ashcombe slumped forward at his desk. The study was tidy, almost austere. Papers were stacked neatly, books aligned with care. Sir Lionel sat in his chair, head bowed, one hand resting upon an unfinished letter. His expression was not one of peace but of surprise, eyes half open, mouth slightly parted. Dr. Hale moved forward immediately, professional instinct taking command. He examined Sir Lionel carefully, checking for signs of life. After a few moments, he straightened. "I'm afraid he is dead," he said quietly. Miss Clara Bell let out a sob and sank into a chair. Margaret Ashcombe stood rigid, one hand gripping the doorframe. Arthur Wynne removed his hat slowly, his face solemn. Dr. Hale cleared his throat. "From the appearance, I would say heart failure. Sir Lionel had been under considerable stress." Poirot stepped closer, his eyes moving not to the body but to the room itself. He noted the closed window, the cold fireplace, the precise placement of objects. Nothing seemed disturbed, nothing appeared missing, and yet something was wrong. The police were summoned, and the house slipped into a state of controlled chaos. Footsteps echoed in the corridors. Doors opened and closed. Whispers followed Poirot as he moved quietly from place to place. When questioned, each guest provided their account. Miss Margaret Ashcombe stated she had retired early, feeling fatigued. She had last seen her uncle after dinner when he excused himself to work in the study. Miss Bell confirmed this, adding that Sir Lionel had asked her to leave him undisturbed. Mr. Wynne claimed he had gone for a short walk in the garden despite the drizzle, then retired to his room. Dr. Hale said he had taken a mild headache and gone to bed shortly after 11. Poirot listened without interruption. The police inspector, a practical man with little patience for subtleties, accepted Dr. Hale's initial assessment. There were no signs of violence, no indication of forced entry, and Sir Lionel's age made heart failure plausible. Still, Poirot requested a moment alone in the study. The inspector agreed, though reluctantly. Poirot approached the desk. The unfinished letter caught his attention immediately. It spoke of rectifying a long-standing wrong and setting matters right while there is still time. It was unsigned. The ink had not yet dried. Poirot frowned. He examined Sir Lionel's spectacles, folded neatly beside the letter. According to Miss Bell, Sir Lionel removed them absent-mindedly and never folded them with such care. Poirot inhaled slowly. There was a faint scent in the room, barely perceptible but unfamiliar. It was not tobacco, nor polish, nor wood smoke. "Curious," he murmured. The inspector returned, informing Poirot that the body would be examined further, but unless something remarkable emerged, the death would be recorded as natural. Poirot nodded politely. In the hallway, the guests gathered in uneasy silence. Their grief seemed genuine, yet strained by something else. Relief, perhaps, or fear. Miss Bell dabbed her eyes nervously. "Sir Lionel was troubled," she said. "He spoke of making changes, important changes." Mr. Wynne shifted uncomfortably. "We all knew he was under pressure. Business matters, you understand?" Margaret Ashcombe spoke softly. "My uncle was a just man. Whatever he intended, he believed it necessary." Poirot studied them all. Grief revealed much, he knew, but so did restraint. That evening, Ashcombe House felt different. The corridors seemed longer, the silence heavier. Lamps cast uncertain shadows against the walls. Poirot stood by his window, gazing out into the misted gardens. A man had died quietly, without struggle or sound. No weapon, no witness, no clear cause. And yet Poirot felt no doubt. This was not the end of the matter. It was only the beginning. Chapter 3. Words left, unsaid. Ashcombe House settled into a strained stillness following Sir Lionel's death. The police remained through the afternoon, their presence both reassuring and oppressive. Doors were left ajar, footsteps echoed too loudly, and every conversation seemed to stop abruptly when someone entered the room. Hercule Poirot observed it all with careful interest. After luncheon, barely touched by anyone, Poirot requested permission to examine the study once more. The inspector, convinced there was little left to discover, agreed readily enough. To him, the matter appeared simple. To Poirot, it was anything but. The study felt colder now. The desk had been cleared of the body, yet the room still carried the weight of Sir Lionel's final moments. Poirot moved slowly, as though walking through a thought rather than a space. He returned his attention to the unfinished letter. The phrasing was deliberate, even restrained. Sir Lionel had chosen his words carefully. There was no anger in them, no accusation, only resolve. A man determined to act, not to threaten. Poirot tapped the paper gently. "Such letters," he murmured, "are not written lightly." He noted the time. The letter had been begun shortly after dinner. Sir Lionel had intended to finish it. Something, or someone, had interrupted him. Poirot examined the shelves, the fireplace, the windows. Everything appeared orderly, too orderly. Sir Lionel was precise, yes, but this arrangement felt purposeful, almost staged. As Poirot left the study, he encountered Miss Clara Bell, standing uncertainly in the corridor. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said kindly, "perhaps you might help me." She stiffened at once. "Help you, Monsieur Poirot?" "Yes. You knew Sir Lionel's habits better than most." Miss Bell nodded. "He was very particular, especially in recent weeks." "About what exactly?" She hesitated. "About privacy, about correspondence." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "He received letters?" "Yes, several. He read them alone and locked them away afterwards." "Did he seem afraid?" Miss Bell considered this. "No, determined, I would say," as though he had reached a decision. Poirot thanked her and moved on. He found Miss Margaret Ashcombe in the small morning room, gazing out at the garden. Her posture was composed, but there was tension in her shoulders. "Miss Ashcombe," Poirot began gently, "forgive me if this is difficult." She turned to him calmly. "I understand, Monsieur Poirot. Your uncle spoke of changes. Did he confide in you?" "Only in general terms," she replied. "He believed something from the past required correction." Poirot inclined his head. "And did this concern you personally?" She met his gaze steadily. "My uncle was a fair man. Whatever he intended, he believed it right." Poirot smiled faintly. She had answered without answering. Later, he sought out Mr. Arthur Wynne, who was pacing the terrace restlessly. "You enjoy walking, monsieur?" Poirot asked. Wynne laughed lightly. "It clears the head." "And last night it cleared your conscience as well?" Poirot asked mildly. Wynne stopped. "I don't follow." "You told the inspector you walked in the garden." "Despite the rain?" Wynne shrugged. "I needed air." Poirot said nothing, merely noting the faint dryness of Wynne's shoes. Finally, Poirot requested a word with Dr. Edwin Hale. They spoke in the library, surrounded by heavy volumes and deep leather chairs. "You had known Sir Lionel for many years," Poirot said. "Yes," Hale replied, "professionally and personally." "And his health?" "Generally good, some stress, but nothing alarming." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Yet you suggested heart failure." "It is not uncommon," Hale said calmly. "No," Poirot agreed. "But neither is it inevitable." Hale met Poirot's gaze without flinching. Poirot thanked him and withdrew. That evening, Poirot dined alone. The others had excused themselves. Grief, they claimed, fatigue, shock. Poirot reflected upon what he had learned. Sir Lionel had intended to act. He had been confident, not fearful. His death had been silent, sudden, and left no obvious trace. No struggle, no noise. And yet Poirot sensed that the key lay not in what had been done, but in what had not been said. The letter had been interrupted, the confession unfinished. Someone had known exactly when to act. Later, Poirot stood once more in the study, now dimly lit. He closed his eyes briefly, reconstructing the scene in his mind. Sir Lionel seated at the desk, writing, pausing, perhaps hearing something, perhaps noticing something unusual. Poirot opened his eyes and inhaled slowly. There it was again, that faint, elusive scent. "Ah," he whispered. The method, Poirot believed, had been chosen for its silence, its cleanliness, its ability to deceive even a trained eye. But the motive that was still concealed, buried beneath years of respectability and careful appearances. Poirot straightened his jacket and adjusted his moustache. "Patience," he told himself. "Truth does not hurry, it waits." Outside, night fell upon Ashcombe House, and with it came the quiet certainty that the past, long ignored, was beginning to demand its reckoning. Chapter 4. The Red Thread. By the fourth day at Ashcombe House, Grief had given way to something less respectable. Suspicion. It crept through the corridors like a draft beneath closed doors, unsettling and persistent. Conversations were shorter now, voices lower. Every glance seemed weighted with meaning. No one trusted anyone else, not entirely. Hercule Poirot noticed everything. The police inspector returned in the morning, brisk and confident. He announced that unless new evidence emerged, Sir Lionel Ashcombe's death would be formally recorded as natural causes. The household reacted with visible relief, though not universally. Miss Clara Bell looked startled. Mr. Arthur Wynne frowned. Miss Margaret Ashcombe remained composed. Dr. Hale, however, appeared almost satisfied. Poirot found this detail most interesting. Later that morning, Poirot requested to see Sir Lionel's bedroom. The inspector raised an eyebrow but agreed. There was little to find. The bed neatly made, clothes laid out for the following day. A man who had planned for tomorrow. Poirot examined the bedside table. A book lay open, its page marked carefully. Sir Lionel had not fallen asleep reading. He had intended to return. Poirot traced the room slowly, his gaze lingering on small details. A half-filled glass of water, a folded handkerchief. Everything suggested routine, until it did not. From the bedroom, Poirot moved once more to the study. This time he noticed something he had previously dismissed. The curtains. He leaned closer, inhaling gently. There it was again, that faint, unfamiliar scent. Barely perceptible, yet distinct. Poirot frowned. Later, he requested the household staff to bring him the remnants of Sir Lionel's evening tea. Miss Bell watched anxiously as the tray was produced. It was his usual herbal infusion, she said quickly. I prepared it myself. Of course, Poirot replied kindly. You are most conscientious. He examined the teacup, the pot, the herbs themselves. He asked questions, how long the tea had steeped, where the herbs were stored, who had access to them. Miss Bell answered carefully, though her hands trembled. Poirot thanked her and dismissed the tray. That afternoon, Poirot allowed a rumour to travel through the house. He did not invent it outright. He merely hinted, with gentle seriousness, that certain substances could be administered unnoticed through warm drinks. The effect was immediate. Miss Bell became pale and withdrawn. Mr. Wynne's curiosity sharpened. Margaret Ashcombe questioned Poirot quietly, her voice controlled, but her eyes intent. Dr. Hale dismissed the idea with professional certainty. Impossible, he said. The symptoms do not match poisoning. Poirot nodded. Perhaps you're right, Doctor. That evening, Poirot observed Miss Bell closely during supper. She barely touched her food. When tea was served, she pushed her cup aside, untouched. Fear, Poirot noted, was rarely logical. Later, Poirot approached her privately. Mademoiselle, he said gently, you loved Sir Lionel. Her eyes filled with tears. He trusted me. And you fear, Poirot continued softly, that this trust may be misunderstood. She nodded miserably. I only did as he asked. Poirot inclined his head. He did not accuse, he did not console, he merely observed. The inspector, meanwhile, began to focus his attention upon Miss Bell. The tea, after all, was an obvious thread. The simplest explanation often appealed most strongly to practical minds. Poirot did nothing to discourage this line of thinking. Instead, he turned his attention elsewhere. He walked with Mr. Wynne in the garden, now dried by a thin autumn sun. You are uneasy, monsieur? Poirot remarked casually. Wynne laughed. Anyone would be. You confirmed Miss Ashcombe's alibi, Poirot said lightly. Yes. And yet you were not with her? Wynne hesitated. No, but I assumed... Assumptions, Poirot interrupted gently, are dangerous. Wynne said nothing. That evening, Poirot reviewed the police notes quietly in the library. Everything pointed neatly towards the secretary. Opportunity, access, nervousness. And yet Poirot felt no satisfaction. The red thread was too bright, too convenient. Sir Lionel Ashcombe had not been careless, nor had his killer. The tea was a distraction designed to draw attention away from something less obvious. Poirot returned once more to the study. He stood before the cold fireplace, his gaze thoughtful. "Fire without flame," he murmured. "Death without struggle." He imagined the room as it had been, Sir Lionel writing, pausing, breathing, something subtle, invisible, effective. Poirot straightened. The method, he believed, did not require ingestion. It required presence, knowledge, precision, and patience. The inspector announced later that night that Miss Bell would be questioned further the next day. Poirot said nothing. As he retired to his room, he paused in the corridor and glanced back towards the study door. The house was quiet, almost peaceful. But Poirot knew better. The red thread had been laid deliberately for those who saw only what they expected to see. The true pattern lay elsewhere, waiting for the little grey cells to pull it gently into the light. Chapter 5. The Misleading Clue. The following morning brought with it a brittle clarity, as though the house itself had resolved upon a conclusion. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Ashcombe House, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. To the police inspector, this seemed an encouraging sign. Mysteries, he believed, ought to conclude neatly, just as rooms were best kept in order. Hercule Poirot, however, knew better. The inspector summoned the household to the drawing-room shortly after breakfast. Miss Clara Bell sat rigidly on the edge of a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Arthur Wynne leaned against the mantelpiece, arms folded. Miss Margaret Ashcombe remained poised, though her eyes betrayed concern. Dr. Hale stood apart, observing with professional detachment. The inspector cleared his throat. "We have examined the tea service used by Sir Lionel Ashcombe on the night of his death," he announced. "While no common poison has been identified, there remains sufficient cause to question its preparation." Miss Bell gasped softly. Poirot watched her carefully. Her distress was genuine, but fear alone was not proof. The inspector continued, outlining inconsistencies in her account. Where had the herbs been sourced? Who else might have handled them? Why had she been alone so late? Miss Bell answered as best she could, her voice trembling. She insisted she had followed Sir Lionel's instructions exactly. She denied altering anything. Dr. Hale interjected calmly. "There is no medical evidence to support poisoning. The symptoms observed do not correspond." The inspector frowned. "Nevertheless, we cannot ignore the circumstances." Poirot inclined his head politely. The circumstances indeed were compelling, too compelling. Later that morning, Poirot requested the inspector's permission to conduct a small experiment. With some reluctance, it was granted. Poirot asked for the study to be sealed for 1 hour. During that time, he remained alone inside, the curtains drawn, the door closed. When he emerged, he appeared thoughtful but unconcerned. "You found something?" the inspector asked. "Not exactly," Poirot replied. "I confirmed something." The inspector pressed him, but Poirot merely smiled. That afternoon, a discovery was made that seemed decisive. One of the maids, cleaning a cupboard near the study, found a small vial wrapped in cloth. It bore no label, but inside remained a faint residue with a bitter scent. The inspector was triumphant. "There it is, concealed, accessible, and near the scene." Miss Bell collapsed into tears. The vial was sent for analysis, and the house buzzed with speculation. Even Margaret Ashcombe seemed shaken. Poirot examined the vial carefully when it was returned. He sniffed it gently, then set it aside. "Interesting," he murmured. That evening, the inspector informed Poirot that the substance was consistent with a fast-acting poison, though the quantity was minimal. "This confirms it," the inspector said. "The tea was the vehicle. Miss Bell had access and opportunity." Poirot shook his head gently. "No," he said. "The tea was innocent." The inspector stared at him. "You cannot be serious?" "On the contrary," Poirot replied, "I am quite serious." He explained that the poison found would have altered the taste noticeably. Sir Lionel, precise and fastidious, would have remarked upon it. Furthermore, the teacup showed no trace of residue. "Then how do you explain the vial?" the inspector demanded. Poirot smiled faintly. "As a prop." The inspector scoffed. Poirot did not argue. He merely asked to speak with Miss Bell once more. She met him in the small parlour, exhausted and pale. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "did Sir Lionel ever ask you to prepare anything unusual for the fireplace?" She blinked in surprise. "The fireplace? No, he dislikes smoke." Poirot nodded. He then spoke with Mr. Wynne, who admitted he had once used the cupboard where the vial was found to store cigars. "And did you notice the vial then?" Poirot asked. "No," Wynne replied quickly. Too quickly. Poirot returned to the study alone. He stood before the fireplace, gazing at the cold grate. "An obvious clue," he murmured, "is often placed to be found." The method, he was certain, did not involve drinking. The poison had been airborne, released subtly and briefly, leaving behind only a whisper of scent. The vial had been placed afterward, to mislead. As night fell, the inspector prepared to make a formal accusation the following day. Poirot remained silent. He stood at his window, watching the lights go out one by one across the estate. Soon he knew he would have to speak, but not yet. The little grey cells required one final arrangement before the truth could be revealed, and when it was, it would overturn everything the others believed they understood. Chapter 6. The Fractured Alibis. The inspector announced his intention to conclude the inquiry the following day. His confidence was evident, even reassuring. For most at Ashcombe House, certainty, any certainty, was preferable to the slow corrosion of doubt. Hercule Poirot alone remained unconvinced. He began the day with a walk through the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back, his steps measured. He was not admiring the autumn roses nor the trimmed hedges, but reconstructing time itself. The evening of Sir Lionel's death lay before him like a puzzle whose pieces were finally revealing their true shapes. One by one, Poirot intended to test the alibis, not with accusations, but with questions so simple they disarmed resistance. He found Miss Margaret Ashcombe in the library. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began gently, "on the night your uncle died, you retired early?" "Yes," she replied. "I was tired." "At what hour?" "Just after 10. "And you did not leave your room?" She hesitated. "I may have stepped into the corridor briefly." "For what purpose?" "I thought I heard a sound." Poirot nodded. "You did not mention this earlier." She met his gaze. "I did not think it important." Poirot smiled faintly. "Very few things are unimportant, mademoiselle." Next, Poirot sought Mr. Arthur Wynne. They spoke in the billiard room, where Wynne was pretending to read a newspaper upside down. "You enjoy walking in the evening?" Poirot said conversationally. "Yes," Wynne replied. "It helps me think." "Yet the gardener informs me the gravel paths were undisturbed that night." Wynne shrugged. "Perhaps I did not walk far." "And yet your shoes were dry," Poirot added gently. "Despite the rain." Wynne's smile faded. "Are you accusing me?" "Not at all," Poirot replied. I am merely arranging facts." Wynne said nothing further. Poirot then turned to Dr. Edwin Hale. They met once more in the library. "You retired early," Poirot said, "because of a headache." "Yes." "At what hour?" 11. "And you did not leave your room thereafter?" Dr. Hale hesitated for the briefest moment. "No." Poirot leaned forward. "The housemaid reports seeing a light beneath your door close to midnight." Dr. Hale stiffened. "I may have risen for water." "Indeed," Poirot said softly. "And the study is conveniently located on the way." Dr. Hale said nothing. Finally, Poirot returned to Miss Clara Bell. She was no longer defensive, only weary. "You were typing correspondence?" Poirot said. "Yes." "Until when?" "Nearly midnight." Poirot glanced at the typewriter in the small office. He lifted the ribbon. "It is not advanced," he said quietly. No new letters were typed. Miss Bell closed her eyes. "Sir Lionel asked me to sit there, to appear occupied. Why?" "He did not say." Poirot nodded slowly. By midday, Poirot had reconstructed the truth of the evening. Not the crime itself, but the movement. Who could reach the study unnoticed? Who could account for their whereabouts, and who could not? What struck him most was this: no one had heard anything. No sound, no disturbance. Sir Lionel had died without struggle. Such deaths, Poirot knew, required not force, but knowledge. That afternoon, Poirot requested the inspector's presence in the study. "Imagine the scene," Poirot said, standing near the desk. Sir Lionel writes. He pauses. He breathes. Poirot gestured toward the fireplace. A small action occurs. Brief, controlled, silent. The inspector frowned. There was no fire. "Exactly," Poirot replied. Poirot demonstrated how heat could be applied briefly. So briefly it left no ash, no smoke, no lasting warmth. Enough to release something subtle into the air. "Air," Poirot continued, "is the most democratic of substances. It does not discriminate." The inspector was silent now. Poirot then revealed his experiment from the previous day. He had sealed himself in the study, replicating conditions as closely as possible. "The scent," Poirot explained, "becomes noticeable only when one knows what to seek." "And who would know?" the inspector asked slowly. "A doctor," Poirot replied. Dr. Hale's name was not spoken, but it did not need to be. That evening, tension reached its peak. The inspector delayed his accusation. Dr. Hale avoided everyone. Arthur Wynne drank too much. Margaret Ashcombe remained calm. Too calm. Poirot stood once more before the study fireplace. The method was now clear, the opportunity nearly so. Only the motive remained fully concealed, and Poirot knew that motive would bind everything together like the final knot in a well-tied package. He adjusted his moustache and allowed himself a small smile. "Tomorrow," he murmured. "The truth will no longer remain polite." Chapter 7. The Weight of the Past. Ashcombe House seemed to hold its breath. By now, no one pretended that Sir Lionel's death was a simple matter. The air itself felt charged, every corridor heavy with unspoken fear. The guests avoided one another, retreating into private corners, as though isolation might offer protection. Hercule Poirot, however, moved with calm assurance. The chaos of emotion only clarified his thoughts. Disorder, he believed, always pointed towards truth, if one observed it correctly. That morning, Poirot asked to see Sir Lionel's personal papers. Miss Margaret Ashcombe hesitated before producing a small, locked drawer from her uncle's desk. The key, she explained, had been found in his pocket. Poirot opened the drawer carefully. Inside were several old documents, legal papers, correspondence, and a thin bundle tied with faded ribbon. The dates caught Poirot's attention immediately. They went back more than 20 years. He examined them slowly. There were medical reports, altered copies, not originals. Signatures that matched, yet did not. Dates adjusted by days, sometimes weeks. Small changes, easily overlooked, but devastating in effect. Poirot's expression hardened. Sir Lionel had not merely been planning a change to his will. He had been preparing to expose something long concealed. Later, Poirot sought out Miss Margaret Ashcombe. "You knew," he said gently. "Not everything, but enough." She did not deny it. "My uncle told me recently he was troubled by what he had discovered." "And you supported him?" "Yes," she said firmly. "It was wrong. Someone had suffered greatly." Poirot nodded. "Justice delayed, mademoiselle, weighs heavily upon the conscience." Poirot then requested a private word with Dr. Edwin Hale. They met in the study, the very room where Sir Lionel had died. Dr. Hale stood stiffly, his expression controlled. "You have found something," Hale said. "Yes," Poirot replied simply. "The past." Hale's jaw tightened. "The past is irrelevant." "On the contrary," Poirot said quietly, "it is everything." Poirot laid the documents on the desk. "Years ago," he continued, "a patient died under your care, a wealthy relative. His will depended upon a medical certification of competence, one you provided." Hale's eyes flickered. "The certification was false," Poirot said. "The patient was not of sound mind. His estate passed elsewhere." "To Sir Lionel," Hale said bitterly. "And later," Poirot continued, "Sir Lionel realized the truth." Hale laughed sharply. Too late to correct it. "Not for him," Poirot said. "He intended to return what was taken and to reveal how it was taken." Hale's composure cracked. "He threatened my reputation," Hale said. "My career." "He threatened your conscience," Poirot replied. Hale said nothing. Poirot did not press further. He did not need a confession, not yet. Instead, Poirot turned his attention briefly to Arthur Wynne. "You knew of the disagreement," Poirot said, "but not its cause." Wynne shook his head. Sir Lionel would not say, only that a matter of justice was involved. "And you stood to lose nothing?" Poirot asked. Wynne hesitated. "Not directly." Poirot let that pass. Finally, Poirot spoke once more with Miss Clara Bell. "He trusted you," Poirot said. "That is why you were asked to remain visible." "Yes," she said softly. "He told me someone might try to stop him." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Sir Lionel had known, perhaps not how, but that danger existed. As evening approached, Poirot gathered his thoughts. The motive was now clear: exposure, ruin, the destruction of a carefully built life. The method had been subtle, precise, and required knowledge beyond the ordinary. The opportunity had been created through misdirection, false alibis, a planted vial, an innocent secretary nearly sacrificed to convenience. Everything now pointed in one direction. Still Poirot waited. That night, Poirot asked the inspector to delay any arrests until morning. "I will require everyone present," Poirot said, "and I will require their attention." The inspector agreed reluctantly. Poirot returned to his room and sat quietly, reflecting. Sir Lionel had died because he believed truth mattered more than comfort, because he believed wrongdoing, even long buried, demanded correction. Poirot respected that. He stood, adjusted his moustache, and allowed himself a final moment of reflection. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "we will speak plainly." Outside, Ashcombe House stood silent beneath the stars, no longer merely a place of shadows and suspicion, but a stage prepared for revelation. The past had waited long enough. Chapter 8. The Order of Truth. The drawing room of Ashcombe House was filled by mid-morning. Curtains were drawn back to admit the pale autumn light, and the atmosphere was one of strained expectancy. Chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle, as though for a performance no one had volunteered to attend. Hercule Poirot stood near the fireplace, immaculate as ever, his expression calm, almost serene. The inspector took a seat near the door, notebook in hand. Miss Margaret Ashcombe sat upright, composed but alert. Miss Clara Bell looked exhausted, her hands folded tightly together. Arthur Wynne leaned against a chair, attempting nonchalance and failing. Dr. Edwin Hale stood apart, his face carefully neutral. Poirot cleared his throat softly. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I thank you for your patience. Sir Lionel Ashcombe was a man who believed in order, moral order as much as any other. It is therefore fitting that we now restore it." No one spoke. Poirot turned slightly toward the inspector. "You were prepared to close this case as a death by natural causes and later to suspect an act of poisoning via the tea." "Yes," the inspector replied. "The evidence supported it." "Ah," said Poirot gently. "It appeared to support it." Poirot moved slowly across the room. The tea was innocent. Sir Lionel was precise, observant. Any alteration in taste would have been noticed immediately. Furthermore, no residue was found in the cup. He paused. The vial, however, was very useful. Too useful. It was placed to be discovered after the death. A distraction. Arthur Wynne shifted uncomfortably. Poirot continued. "Let us consider instead the manner of death. Sir Lionel died seated quietly without struggle. There was no sound, no disturbance. His heart stopped suddenly, but not naturally." Dr. Hale's jaw tightened. Poirot gestured toward the study door. In that room, one could detect a faint, fleeting scent, barely perceptible, unless one knew what to seek. A substance requiring warmth, not flame. Released briefly, then gone. The inspector frowned. "Cyanide vapor?" "Precisely," Poirot said. "Administered not through ingestion, but inhalation." Miss Clara Bell gasped. Poirot raised a hand. "Do not fear, mademoiselle. You're innocent." She looked at him in disbelief. Poirot turned to Dr. Hale. "Such a method requires knowledge, medical knowledge, the confidence to use a substance precisely enough to kill quickly, silently, and leave almost nothing behind." Dr. Hale remained silent. Poirot pressed on. "Now let us consider motive. Sir Lionel had discovered a truth buried for more than 20 years, a falsified medical certification, an inheritance redirected unjustly." He placed the old documents upon the table. "These papers show deliberate alteration, a patient declared competent when he was not, a will validated under false conditions." The inspector leaned forward sharply. Poirot's voice was calm but firm. "Sir Lionel intended to correct this injustice. He was writing his confession. He meant to expose the crime and restore what had been taken." Poirot looked directly at Dr. Hale. Such an exposure would destroy a reputation built carefully over decades, a respected physician unmasked as a fraud. Dr. Hale laughed softly, without humour. "You are very certain, Monsieur Poirot?" "Yes," Poirot replied. "Because of what you did after the death." Dr. Hale stiffened. "You suggested heart failure immediately. You dismissed poisoning too quickly. You provided an alibi that placed you conveniently out of sight, yet the housemaid saw your light late and your path took you past the study." Poirot allowed the silence to stretch. "You prepared the compound earlier, concealed it within the fireplace grate. A brief application of heat released the vapor. Sir Lionel, alone, unsuspecting, inhaled it and died." Margaret Ashcombe covered her mouth. "You then ensured suspicion fell elsewhere," Poirot continued. "The planted vial, the convenient focus on Miss Bell. You relied upon appearances, and upon the inspector's desire for a simple answer. Poirot stepped back. "But you underestimated one thing." Dr. Hale met his gaze warily. "And that is?" "The psychology," Poirot replied. "You feared exposure more than justice. That fear shaped every decision you made." For a long moment, Dr. Hale said nothing. Then his shoulders slumped. "Yes," he said quietly. "I altered the records. I convinced myself it was harmless. When Sir Lionel confronted me, I knew my life was finished." He looked around the room. "I could not allow that." The inspector rose. "Dr. Edwin Hale, you are under arrest." As Hale was led away, the tension seemed to drain from the room. Miss Clara Bell began to cry, this time with relief. Margaret Ashcombe closed her eyes briefly, then straightened. Arthur Wynne exhaled shakily. Good God, Poirot adjusted his moustache. Sir Lionel believed that truth, even delayed, must be spoken, Poirot said softly. He paid dearly for that belief, but today he is vindicated. The inspector extended his hand. My thanks, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot accepted it politely. As the room emptied, Poirot stood alone for a moment, gazing at the window. Order had been restored, not without cost, but truth rarely came cheaply. He turned, picked up his hat, and prepared to depart Ashcombe House. The silence remained, but now it was the silence of resolution. The case is closed, but the next mystery is already waiting. This is unknown suspect